Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers. Primed for disappointment. I ask you, Anthony, what's new and exciting in your world this week?
You told me a story, I can't remember the details, of a politician who was disliked so much in the election that he lost against a dead guy. I've got a story to top that. India Walton of Buffalo, New York, was running for mayor. She was running unopposed and yet lost the election.
How big a loser do you have to be to run unopposed and lose an election?
It's astounding. She was running as an open socialist. In fact, it got to the point that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, and Elizabeth Warren, all three of them stumped for her, and still she lost against no one.
That could fuel some opposition, near as I can tell.
It's
if I were running for office, I would want my opponent to have those three come along and help out.
Apparently what had happened here, in the primary, she was running against the incumbent mayor and beat him in the primary. There was no Republican on the other side to run against her, so she's running unopposed. She won the primaries, running the general election unopposed. The former mayor, Byron Brown, launches a write-in campaign and actually defeats her as a write-in candidate by a wide margin.
Boy, that hardly ever happens.
So technically, she was running unopposed and yet still managed to lose. What have our politics come to? That candidates are this bad. I mean, they're supposed to be, the cream of the crop, right? These are people we hold up to be our political leaders. What we seem to have done is create a race to the bottom. Every election, the candidates are worse than the last one.
Yeah, it is a little strange. But you started off by telling us that there was this guy, and the guy's name was John Ashcroft. He later became a cabinet-level holder in the Bush administration. And he lost to a guy named Carnahan. Carnahan had died prior to the election, and he beat Ashcroft by about 50,000 votes just the same. He was the first person ever posthumously elected to the United States Senate.
But how embarrassing must that be? This is your profession. You're a politician. And you can't win against a dead guy, or worse, against no one.
It's absolutely humiliating, and you would think that whoever lost that badly would skulk away and never come back. But you'd be wrong. They are politicians. They seem to have absolutely no shame, and they just go run around for another office.
All I can say is, it's a good thing that we don't have none of the above, because none of the above would be winning landslides across the country.
I would vote none of the above in almost every race. In my entire life, I don't think I've ever seen a politician on any level that I thought, oh, wow, I should vote for that person. Which kind of dovetails into my observation this weekend, because I'm reading breathless headlines. I'll read you one from thehill.com. Democrats brace for flood of retirements after Virginia rout. Now, I'm not sure that there was a Virginia rout. The Democrats lost, and they had every reason to think that they were going to win. So, even if it's not a rout, it's a real problem for them. The retirement angle is an interesting one. As of this moment, there are 14 Democrats in Congress who will not be running again. Just to put that into perspective, at present, the Democrats have an 8-seat majority. What's happening here is what happens every time we have midterm elections after a new president takes control of the Oval Office. We have Joe Biden, a Democrat. I can guarantee that there will be a net loss of seats in the House of Representatives for the Democrats in the next election. That's inevitably how it always goes. So I'm not expecting anything new here. Some of these Democrats are looking at the reality that they now face, and they're deciding to take off. This is a when question, not an if question, right? You can either leave now, you can leave before the election, or you could get voted out after. That's a tough set of circumstances to look at, right? If you're a Democrat in a marginal district, you're probably just going to get out without the humiliation of a gigantic loss. We get these switches every time there's a midterm election after a new president. And if you want to look for a little more of what the actual problem is, Joe Biden's approval level right now is 38%.
Wow. He's not even a full year into his presidency.
It's 37.8% approve, 59% disapprove. undecided 3.2.
Good Lord. And that's astounding for a guy who really hasn't done that much. I mean, he's talked about doing things, but he hasn't achieved anything so far.
You've jumped right onto the actual issue here, and we like people who hold positions of great power who can't get a thing done. That's perfect. But for most people, they want him to actually do something. Think about this. Do you approve or disapprove of the job Kamala Harris has done as vice president? 27.8% approval.
27?
10 percentage points lower than Biden. This is turning into a train wreck of an administration.
It's getting down to the approval ratings of Congress, which is like on the level of the TSA.
Right. And apparently the 37.8% figure for Biden isn't quite as low as Donald Trump got. But you can see that we're bouncing off a bottom here. And people who think that there's a gigantic difference between these two people, they're about the same person in terms of governance. In terms of style, there's a gigantic difference. But this is a very bad set of circumstances for Democrats. If Biden doesn't get significantly higher, and by significantly higher, I mean about 15 percentage points higher, he will be unable to offer any assistance to Democrats running for Congress. That trend will go even worse. I mean, we may end up looking at a 1994 style of beating. And you might remember 94 when Newt Gingrich ushered in Republicans across the country in districts they had never won before with the Contract for America. Which, of course, that brings us to the foolishness of the week. And so foolish is it, I don't even know where to start. There is a company, very valuable corporation, that is encouraging their employees to state their race and gender during presentations that they make. Go ahead, ask me how come.
Yeah, why? First off, shouldn't this be obvious?
Well, no, because blind people might not be able to tell and therefore would not know where your biases are. One would think that you could walk into a room and ascertain pretty quickly whether there was a blind person in it, and if so, making a little bit more upfront of what you want to say just to introduce yourself. But how many times do we walk into a room and find a blind person that needs things explained?
And what's the presumption here? That your biases match one for one your gender and race?
Don't you want to ask me what company this is?
Oh, please do. What? Facebook?
It's Microsoft. It's Microsoft.
Microsoft, really? I would never have guessed Microsoft for that sort of foolishness.
I've got a local news site from California to put in the show notes, but Ant, let me read a little bit of it to you. This week's annual Microsoft Ignite conference drew criticism in response to its corporate introduction, which pointed out people's race, hairstyles, genders, and acknowledged the indigenous land on which the company was built in Washington state. During the introduction, the hosts first acknowledged that the land where the Microsoft campus is situated was traditionally occupied by the Sammamish, Duwamish, and Snoqualmie, the Muckleshoot, the Snohomish, the Tulalip, and other Coast Salish peoples since time immemorial. Let me just apologize in a blanket sort of way for all of the mispronunciations you just heard. A people that are still here, it continues, continuing to honor and bring to light their ancient heritage, says senior program manager and on-air host Allison Wines, who works in the developer tools division. I'm an Asian and white female with dark brown hair, she continued, wearing a red sleeveless top.
Now, hang on a second. A person who's blind from birth, describing your sleeveless top as red is going to have no meaning.
Well, it might even be offensive, wouldn't it? It seems ableist. That's the word we're supposed to use.
Oh, my God. As far as foolishness is concerned, I would have no idea where to begin here either.
I present it to our listeners as a public service. What conclusions you draw, that's on you.
Here's the thing that annoys me. They want to acknowledge the indigenous peoples who had the land before they did. Look, if you mean anything by that, shut down the office and give the land back. If you're not going to do that, then shut up about it, because you really don't mean anything.
That's right. If you think it's an absurd injustice that was perpetrated on these people that you are now benefiting from, and I don't think you have to give them the land back necessarily, but you have to make them whole. Well, so pay them off.
Yeah, you're Microsoft. You can afford to do that.
Yep, that's right. And they're not going to do that.
Right. So all of this is just posturing to make us look good and wholesome and inclusive.
Well, all of the wokeism is posturing. It's virtue signaling, just of a different kind. I'm tired of being hectored by people who think they believe something, but when push comes to shove, clearly don't believe it.
Right. And that's not to take anything away from people who truly believe it's an injustice, but it is to point out that if you're not willing to do that, I'm not sure you actually believe it's an injustice.
Oh, I'm sure you don't. If you're not willing to do something that you want to force other people to do, congratulations, you're the problem.
To get more Ant and James, buy a copy of our excellent book, Cooperation and Coercion. You can find the paper and electronic versions on Amazon and the audio version on Audible.
I guess this week we're bound to talk about why you didn't win a Nobel Prize, but other people did.
Yeah, well, that's not happening right off, so say that.
Well, don't feel bad because I didn't win one either, but maybe next year. That said, there is some interesting stuff here on the Nobel.
There's some interesting things and some interesting misperceptions. The economist David Card won the Nobel Prize in economics this year for contributing to our understanding of labor markets and analyzing natural experiments.
All right, hold the phone. You're going to have to tell me what that even means.
Yeah, and that's actually interesting. And here's the thing. This is one of the reasons people say that economics isn't a science. In the life and the physical sciences, scientists conduct experiments by putting things under control. So, for example, you want to know the effect of a chemical on a plant. You get two of the same kind of plant. You subject them to the same conditions, the same light, the same heat, the same humidity, everything the same, except for one thing. You apply the chemical to one plant, you don't apply it to the other. And if you see they grow differently, you conclude, well, the difference must be the chemical because everything else was the same. And you can conduct controlled experiments like that in the physical and life sciences. For obvious reasons, you can't do that in the social sciences, right? Unless you live in a place like North Korea, you can't control people to that extent.
Well, it's even worse than that, because the minute you start talking to them, you realize that they lie all the time.
Right, yeah, it becomes really difficult to measure things.
It's remarkable. And for guys like you and me, that makes a real problem.
It makes a huge problem. The way we get around it in economics, to the extent that we can, is we try not to ask people questions about themselves. Instead, we observe their behavior. Or there's an interesting psychological trick. When you have no other option but to ask them about themselves, you don't ask them about themselves. You ask them about their friends and neighbors. And everybody thinks that he or she is average, and so whatever's true about you, subconsciously you assume is true about other people. So I can ask you about other people, and you'll tend to answer honestly.
That's really funny. And it plays big when you're trying to find an answer to the question, something like, are you racist? Because
Yes.
Everybody's answering no to that one. Are your neighbors racist? Oh, now we got something. And if we could call you and ask about your neighbor and call your neighbor and ask about you, we've gotten pretty much all the way down the road.
We've got to do things like this to get around the fact that we can't conduct controlled experiments. One of the things that we do is to use econometric techniques. And you've probably seen an analogy of this. If you ever watched a spy movie where they've surreptitiously recorded a conversation they want to get, and it's not just the conversation, there's all kinds of background noise, maybe there's other people talking, there's cars in the background, whatever, and you can't hear the conversation on the tape. So what they'll do is they'll have a guy at a computer running some stuff to filter out the noise so you can hear just the conversation. Well, believe it or not, that's actually a thing. And we do that in econometrics all the time. For example, suppose I want to know the effect of years of education on lifetime earnings. Well, what I do is I collect data not just on years of education, lifetime earnings, but also things like your demographics, your parents' earnings, your personal health. I can collect all of this data and I can effectively filter out all of those things. So I get just the relationship between years of education and lifetime earnings. Now, as you can imagine, that's pretty hard and there's lots of noise in the data when you're done, but that's one of the procedures we use. David Card gets the Nobel Prize for using a different procedure, and that is to look for and analyze what we call natural experiments. And there are pluses and minuses to natural experiments. The plus is that you don't need to filter out these various things I'm talking about. The minus is you got to rely on serendipity. You've got to be able to look around and find experiments that have happened because you can't conduct them yourself.
So what is a natural experiment? If we have to go off to look for it in nature, which makes sense given the word natural, I'm not exactly clear, and I bet our listeners aren't either, about what you're really talking about here.
You and I have actually written on this without using the term natural experiments. We looked at the incidence of underage binge drinking in Pennsylvania before and after the state relaxed its monopoly on alcohol sales.
I remember this like it was yesterday, Ant, because everybody on the Pennsylvania state side was saying, if we do this, if we liberalize our liquor laws, there'll be carnage everywhere.
Right. And so what you get is a natural experiment. You have Pennsylvania in the year before they relaxed the alcohol monopoly, and Pennsylvania in the year after they relaxed the alcohol monopoly, and you can look at the underage binge drinking rate before and after, and there's an interesting natural experiment.
I remember this, but I'm betting a lot of our listeners don't. What was the result?
What we found was that the underage binge drinking rate in Pennsylvania dropped 18% before versus after they relaxed the alcohol monopoly.
All right, let me get this straight. It became easier to get alcohol and binge drinking decreased.
Yeah, how about that? Underage binge drinking decreased.
What's up with that?
So the argument, of course, is that one of the things you have possibly done is that you have provided a tremendous profit incentive not to serve minors. Because before, when the state is handling the alcohol, you'll get in trouble if you're selling to minors. But the person who's behind the counter doesn't have hundreds of thousands of dollars invested in the state store. The state store belongs to the state. But if I'm a private retailer, yeah, my investment's on the line.
The guy who works in the state shop is functionally a bureaucrat.
That's right.
We don't perceive of them as such, but that's what it is.
There's an interesting counter-argument to this that actually proponents of the state monopoly have made. And the counter-argument is maybe Pennsylvania's underage binge drinking rate fell 18%, but if it also fell 18% throughout the rest of the country, well, that doesn't mean anything, does it? That's an interesting counter-argument. But we apply this technique that David Card was using called a difference in differences, if you're interested in the technical stuff. Basically, what it boils down to is we said, okay, underage binge drinking fell in Pennsylvania by 18% over this period. By how much did it fall in the rest of the country over the same period? And the answer there was 9%.
Oh, well, how about that?
That becomes much more compelling now, doesn't it?
Indeed it does. And I finally get to breathe easy knowing that all the bureaucrats in Pennsylvania have in fact been lying even after I moved away.
We took a chunk out of them by titling that op-ed, "We Told You So."
I believe we got some first-class hate mail from somebody in the path of the liquor store.
Oh, it was the president of the union that represents the state store workers.
My interactions with union folk always kind of go the same way. But I think the other one of these that we did is way more interesting.
And the other one was marijuana in Colorado.
In Denver specifically.
Denver.
But yeah.
The argument was that if Denver legalized marijuana, again, you'd have young people using it.
It was so much worse than that. There's one minor league newspaper in Colorado who just keeps going over this over and over and over again. And they declared that if marijuana legalization went forward, that all of Colorado would end up being a post-apocalyptic hellscape.
Right.
And we read that and we thought, oh, that's just idiotic.
That's not right.
Indeed it was. That's idiotic. And we looked into this, and lo and behold, what did we find? Every category of crime had decreased after legalization, even murder.
And importantly, underage use of marijuana, which I believe it's a CDC, has a survey that comes out each year. They survey minors, asking them, do you use marijuana? Now, I can understand there's going to be a natural reticence for the minors to answer honestly. So I don't know what the CDC does in the background to help mitigate that. But nonetheless, they have this survey that goes out every year, and the survey indicated a marked decline in usage of marijuana amongst the underage.
And look, I'm going to make the case. You're going to walk around in Denver, you're going to smell some weed. I've been to Denver. I smell the weed. So there's an aesthetic issue. You might not like what that smells like, but none of these crime things ever worked out the way that the banners wanted them to.
And it goes back to this argument that actually the proponents made in favor of controlling marijuana, controlling alcohol. And it was a profit incentive argument that if we allow this stuff, these heartless retailers in seeking profit will sell to everybody, including our children.
Oh, come on.
Well, but that's the interesting thing. The profit incentive actually works in the opposite direction.
Of course it does. I spent most of the last 3 or 4 days responding to people who were warning me that my children would go out trick-or-treating and come home with edible drugs. My point here is the same year in and year out. Who's giving drugs away and can I get there before sundown?
Right. Who's going to that expense?
Well, yeah, these things are not inexpensive. And if you think people are giving drugs to your children, you're out of your mind. More than that, Aunt, I went to the weed stores in Colorado just to see what they were like, really. It was astonishing. You walk up, there's a line. You can't go in until the place is sufficiently empty. You have to be escorted in. You're given a concierge to walk you through the buying process. You get what you want. You pay for it, typically in cash, at the front, and then you leave, and only when you leave can the next person come in.
Right.
And then I figured, okay, they're going overboard here. And then we legalized recreational marijuana here in Arizona. Same exact story. That's just how we do it. And guess what? Nobody here can tell the difference pre and post.
And this is a natural experiment. You get to see what happened before compared to what happened after.
And, that's really interesting. And I suspect it gets more to a point that you and I make all the time. You call it subsidiarity. I call it federalism. It's the ability of local people or state folks to make decisions on their own for themselves.
Yeah.
The difference state to state allows us the ability to look at things pretty clearly in these terms.
So if we go back to David Card and his Nobel Prize, he wins the Nobel Prize for this groundbreaking work in analyzing natural experiments. And people immediately got confused between the Nobel Prize being awarded for that and some work he did back in the mid-1990s that applied his techniques to a particular natural experiment. And that particular natural experiment was a rise in the minimum wage. Prior to the mid-1990s, New Jersey raised its minimum wage, Pennsylvania did not. And if you compare minimum wage jobs along that Pennsylvania-New Jersey border, before versus after New Jersey raises its minimum wage, you have a natural experiment where the Pennsylvania side of the border becomes the control case because they did not raise their minimum wage, and the New Jersey side becomes the experiment case where you're raising the minimum wage. With this natural experiment, you can look at this and come to some conclusion about what happens to employment when you raise the minimum wage. This is why Card, and he published it with another economist, Kruger, why Card and Kruger's article got so much press, because I shouldn't say they concluded, they were represented as concluding that raising the minimum wage does not cause unemployment. And of course, everyone who's pro-minimum wage grabbed onto that and said, finally, we've got evidence you can raise the minimum wage and people will be better off.
And when you say everybody, what you're really saying is the American press.
Yes.
Economists would read this and say, oh, that's interesting. Maybe we should look a lot closer. People in the press would say, well, there it is. We always knew this anyway.
The interesting comment amongst many economists at the time was the most astounding thing about their study was that it passed the peer review process for reasons that I will go into here in a moment.
And people should know this going in. The peer review process is largely a sham. But anyway, tell them how it's a sham.
We should probably do an entire episode just on that.
I don't think I'd want to submit our listeners to that. So.
Here's the thing, and I want to underline again, the work for which Card received the Nobel Prize is excellent work on utilizing natural experiments to tease out meaningful results. This particular application of his technique has some serious flaws. I'll give you a few of them. First, Card and Kruger compared unemployment 4 months before New Jersey raised its minimum wage to 4 months after it raised its minimum wage. So they're looking at that 8-month interval from 4 months before to 4 months after. And that sounds pretty reasonable. You want to see what happens to employment, look at what happens before and after the minimum wage, like we did with the alcohol. Look at what happens before and after partial privatization. But here's the kicker. New Jersey had passed the law raising the minimum wage 2 years earlier. It was set to go into effect 2 years later. So businesses were expecting this increase for a 24-month period. And so you would conclude that given the businesses were expecting this, they would be transitioning toward whatever employment level they intend to be at long before Card and Kruger come along and start doing their analysis. And so that's one reason why you would expect that their results would be biased toward seeing no effect, because the bulk of the effect was probably happening prior to their 8-month window that they looked at. Second problem, they looked at chain restaurants. Now, Card and Kruger, when they wrote the paper, they said they're looking at employees in chain restaurants. But when the press got hold of it, they twisted the words to say that Card and Kruger were looking at minimum wage workers in general. This is not minimum wage workers in general. It's specifically restaurant workers, more than that, specifically restaurant workers at chain restaurants. And what's the deal here? Well, a chain restaurant on average is going to be better able to endure a minimum wage hike than are smaller restaurants. And so again, the results will tend to be biased toward a finding of no employment effect.
And in fairness, we have to take them seriously. They're doing a serious thing, but there are problems. How do we get around this? How do we do an honest study on minimum wage? I can't see it.
You see how difficult this is. This goes back to why Card is well deserving of the Nobel Prize. He's developing techniques that helped us to analyze these natural experiments. Now, the application here was problematic, but the techniques are what were important. Another problem, and this perhaps is the most damning problem, Card and Kruger didn't actually look at payroll data.
What the hell?
When they asked the question, what happened to your employment? Are you employing more people after the minimum wage or fewer people? They actually didn't look at payroll data. Instead, they telephoned the restaurants.
You got to be kidding me.
Nope. They asked whoever answered the phone how many people worked there.
Come on. As a political philosophy PhD student, I took statistics, and I know that is no way to go about your business.
It's a very messy way of doing it. The much clearer way is to look at payroll data because this is the official stuff you hand to the IRS. Now, of course, there are going to be people under the table and all of that, but it is much more likely that payroll data numbers are accurate versus asking whoever picks up the phone. And here's an interesting thing. You ask, what can you do with a study like this? In one of the rare instances of replication, two other economists, Newmark and Washer, came along, I think it was 2 years later, and replicated Card and Kruger's study. They looked at the exact same thing Card and Kruger looked at. The only difference is they used actual payroll data. And lo and behold, what did they find? Exactly what economic theory predicts. The minimum wage goes up, and we got unemployment. They found the unemployment effects that theory would predict using actual payroll data as opposed to using the telephone survey data. Now, the sad thing is, Newmark and Washer are never mentioned. It's always Card and Kruger when someone wants to say, well, minimum wage is good.
Why would they be? They're those right-wing reactionaries who want to keep people poor.
Well, in an interesting twist, Newmark and Washer published their replication in the exact same journal that Card and Kruger published their original study in.
As a guy who decides what to publish and what not to publish on a very prominent website, hats off to the journal. They accepted two very different sorts of things, and people could now look at both of them and draw their own conclusions.
And that's how science is supposed to work.
Supposed to. I have no criticism for that journal whatsoever. I think it's a great thing.
So these are well, I shouldn't say my criticism. These are criticisms that Newmark and Washer brought up in their replication. But I'll add one other thing, and this note goes to people who aren't economists who would read these studies like this and report in their own words what they think they read. And here's the thing. Card and Kruger, in their article, found no evidence that increasing the minimum wage caused unemployment. Let me say that again. They found no evidence that increasing the minimum wage caused unemployment. Now, most reasonable people would hear that sentence and think that it's the same as saying they found evidence that increasing the minimum wage does not cause unemployment. There's a subtle difference, but they're importantly not the same. In a statistical analysis, when you find no evidence, you have not found evidence against something. You have found no result.
I remember no result from my graduate school days.
Right. Well, it's like you're sitting there in your office, James. I know you have your dog, Molly, and you want to know, is Molly in the house? You sit there in your office, you look around your office, and you don't see Molly. What a statistician would say is there is no evidence that Molly is in the house. But notice, you would not conclude that Molly's outside. The only thing you conclude is you looked around your room and you don't see her. And that's the difference between what people think Card and Kruger said, which is increase in minimum wage does not cause unemployment, and what they actually said. There's no evidence that increasing the minimum wage causes unemployment.
In the end, Ant, when you take a look at what the committee chose, what do you think? I mean, did Card deserve a Nobel Prize for this?
Well, that goes beyond my pay grade. Econometrics is my area of expertise, but labor markets and this particular piece of econometrics he does are not. Nonetheless, what I know of Card, this is a serious piece of work that has contributed a tremendous amount to our understanding of natural experiments.
So exactly what you would want somebody receiving the Nobel Prize to have, this kind of work. And yet he's going to be remembered at the end of the day for something else, and we're going to have a tough time separating out those two things.
Let's underline that once more. He did not get the Nobel for finding that the minimum wage doesn't cause unemployment. But that's what people are going to point to, particularly proponents of the minimum wage.
It's what people have pointed to every day since he was awarded the prize.
Yeah.
Okay. And I guess that's just how it's going to have to be. And that's all we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Join us next week. Until then, you can find us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes.
Invite them to our Facebook group, Words and Numbers Backstage.
Yep, you can come over there if you like. That's better than email, broadly speaking, but...
No, nothing's better than email.
God, you're an idiot. Go ahead. Tell them.
Send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com, and I will answer you. And James might answer you as well.
I might, but I might not. Until next week, Ant, have a good one. And everybody, if I can prevail upon you just one more second, please be nice to each other. We'll see you next week.
See you next week, James.